We'd like to extend a special note of thanks to the Reverend Kimberly Quinn-Johnson, who delivered this message entitled Looking for God on November 15th, 2020. Today, I have joining me Reverend Schuyler Vogel, who is our senior minister at Fourth Universalist Society. And we're going to just discuss some of the meanings and especially the history involved in all of this that was discussed in the sermon. So, Reverend Schuyler, thank you for joining me.
Thanks for having me. It's good to be back.
So one of the things that really stood out to me from this reflection is thinking about the history. I know at the beginning of the message, she said something along the lines of that often we think of these transcendentalists as these privileged white men who like to go hide in the forest. I think that sometimes seems a little bit of a fair characterization of this group of people. But I don't think it's a whole characterization. It doesn't really give the full history of their lives, even if at times they may have tried to run away from problems. What do you think about the transcendentalists as a whole? What appeals to you in thinking about them?
Yeah, it's a great question. And I think Reverend Kimberly did a great job of holding in tension and in balance the complexities of that movement and those individuals. You know, they were as a whole, obviously, they were white, they were well off, many were Harvard educated. They were an elite group by and large. Not entirely, but by and large they were. I think we should definitely keep that in mind. Some of their philosophy and theology does not speak to us today in the way that maybe we would think it would be. Emerson's emphasis on self-reliance and individualism certainly is something that I think many of us Unitarian Universalists today would hear and read and listen to and think, gosh, that sounds kind of right wing. You know, the idea that like, oh, you can just depend on yourself and you'll be okay. Anyone can kind of follow your rely on yourself and you'll be okay. I think most of our theology today sees that as problematic for good reason. I mean, we live in a world that is highly interdependent. We see the dangers of individualism, even with wearing masks, right? People who refuse. You can be very self-motivated, and there's a real dark side to that. So I think their legacy is complicated in that way. But I also think there's a lot of really positive things that have come out of the Transcendentalists. I think the first thing to think about is they were definitely white people, and they were definitely people like Thoreau who went off to the woods and gets kind of mocked for, oh, he's taking a little vacation and he went and got lunch at his mom's place, and Emerson really owned the land, and he did laundry in town, and that's all true. But Thoreau never claimed that wasn't true. He never made any kind of deceptive claims to what he was doing. He was just doing what he was doing. So I think that's important, right? So like the deception, our ignorance about where he was and what he was saying is on us, not on him. He went to live in the woods and tried to be intentional about his life, and did not claim that he had any other thing that he was doing. So I think that's important. I also think that that there is a tremendous amount of wisdom that came from their work. Reverend Kimberly spoke about Thoreau's refusal to pay taxes and being thrown into jail. It was one of the first public acts of civil disobedience that our country witnessed. It inspired Mahatma Gandhi in India. It inspired Martin Luther King Jr. The influence of the Transcendentalists was far and wide for many, many years, and still that day. In addition to being the beginning of the American environmentalist movement and turning Unitarianism from an Enlightenment religion to more of a romantic religion of the heart. You can just go on and on about all the many contributions that they have to offer.
Right. And I think something that you really hit on there was this tendency that we disconnect people from their history. These were specific people existing at a specific time, and then even when we learn about them in AP American literature back in high school, we hear about their ideas of these self-reliance, to be out in nature. We hear about that, but we don't I don't remember hearing, oh, they were abolitionists and they did this thing and they were involved in this political action. You didn't hear that. You heard he went out and lived in the woods, and that's it. Like and then now he's recognized as an important figure in American literature, sort of thing. It's not, you're not given him in his whole context, just like they often do with a lot of different figures. And I think on the same level, like as liberal religious folks often have that same tendency that we think that we are the most enlightened and that we need to discount everything that's come before us, and often that like is at the expense of not paying attention to the history that maybe got us to this present moment.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right, and I think it's so important to have context. Ember, because we've been reading similar things, that abolitionists today, you think about abolitionists and it seems like the obvious moral choice, right? You're against slavery. But during the time of the Transcendentalists, abolitionism was really radical. Abolitionists were people that you did not, if you wanted to be a respectable citizen, associate with. To be an abolitionist was to be considered akin to being a communist or an anarchist or something that is very edgy. And so for a lot of these abolitionists who were also transcendentalists, there was an edginess to them. A lot of them supported John Brown, who, you read history about John Brown, was hardly a moderate fellow. I mean, he was all for armed insurrection to protect and liberate slaves, and was responsible for killing people in that mission. And the Transcendentalists, including people like Emerson, were like, let's fundraise for that guy. That's intense, and it doesn't come without cost either. I mean, I think you look at Transcendentalists, a lot of them were wealthy and privileged, and there were some that risked a lot for these causes. I think about Bronson Alcott, who is the father of Louisa May Alcott, who wrote Little Women. Alcott was one of the most pioneering educators in early America, and he didn't believe in physical violence against children. He believed in culturing in the mind, and he was also he believed in integrating his classrooms. And there was an opportunity when he started the school that he was going to let in Black children, and all of his friends, everyone in the culture said that's a terrible idea. You will lose your school. Parents will not let their kids go to school with Black children. And Bronson Alcott said, I don't care. It's the right thing. I'm going to do it. And all of Bronson's friends were right. The parents pulled out their kids, and Bronson lost his school. And Bronson was constantly broke. And he could have had a very successful school if he did not compromise his values, but he did. He went full force into it and did what he thought was right, and helped push the conversation a little bit forward. So some of them are very privileged, and some of them also did sacrifice a lot for their values.
Right. I think you really can't discount that sacrifice for your values. I think that's very true. That sometimes it's that case of what are we doing with this privilege? Like, if they were dedicating their lives to abolishing slavery at a time when nearly everybody else was like, that doesn't seem like a very reasonable idea. That's a pretty big way to risk their privilege. So I think that, yeah, they can give us a lot of inspiration there. I do think that, that some part of a part of the vein that has continued on of their thought has, like you said, become much more that self-reliance and like let's go back to nature sort of the trend. They've forgotten the radical part and kept like the let's go live in a commune. I know one of I've seen a meme 1.5 million times, and however well intentioned, that somebody will share that says like, oh, let's get $50,000 together and go buy some land and live in a community together. And everybody shares it, and I'm like, guys, like a lot of people have done this. It takes a lot of work to go intentionally build a community together, but it's become like this kind of obsession, like that we need to go reach pristine nature, which to some level has been linked in many ways to colonialism, like that need to go grab this new land and make the right society on it. But I worry that some of their message seems to have been lost, that this radical edge that we heard of both in this reflection, but also in our readings of history, that radical edge has been lost.
Yeah, I think it has. I think that this key about transcendentalists being deeply unpopular is really important and can't be forgotten. And recognizing that these efforts to remove yourself from society, which was, at the time there was a whole era in American history when utopian communities were very in. There was, they were experiencing the rise of industrial societies. There was a feeling that was bad in some moral way. Thoreau talked about seeing the train. I mean, we go to Walden Pond now. I had this image growing up that Walden Pond was this like remote, desolate wilderness. It's far more in the woods than it ever was then. He could see a train from the pond. I mean, there's a train that went by multiple times a day. When Thoreau was there, New England was far more deforested then than it is now. And he was close to things. But I think this idea that people wanted to try to recreate their societies apart from the society that was corrupted was very popular, and it almost across the board, it failed. Another big transcendentalist was a guy named George Ripley, who was running these circles. He started a community called Brook Farm. And one of the things that we learned from him and from that was that people act badly no matter where they are, no matter how intentionally. And it was a beautiful thing for a short time, and then it became corrupted, and there was a fire, and that didn't help. But remember, I think your instinct, right, is really true. Is that you can't escape society's problems by going off into the woods or anywhere else. You have to face them, and that's part of our responsibility, is to face them with courage rather than try to escape.
I suppose to tie it also to some of the themes that we've been working through in the RE content that has been coming out. We've been talking about community, and this month was also talking about community care. And, it's being involved in community. It's not always easy. Being involved in society is not always easy. But we have to engage in it. Like just running away just means that we're creating a new society in a different form, in a different spot. If we aren't engaging in society to create the change that we want to see and to help others, then it's ultimately just going to be a cycle that we need to learn from this history. Like, this is why even as somebody who would be described as like this progressive theology sort of person myself, like that I still find it very, very helpful to study history and learn about these past movements and to think about what mistakes they made so that I'm not making the same mistakes. There's no reason to go make the same mistakes that somebody's already made. So it really is key for us to learn a little bit more from the history of the people that are the forebearers, not forefathers, the forebearers of where we are now as part of the UUA.
I think that's absolutely right. We have to learn history to not repeat it. And I think to piggyback off that, I think the other big lesson that history has for me as a almost history teacher, had I not gone into ministry, is that history is also very hope-inducing. And it's hope-inducing not only because there are examples of people who have fought the good fight long before any of us were alive, and fought fights that we don't even remember, but were trying their best. But I think it's also hopeful in a more subtle way, which is that I think a lot of the despair that people feel in the world today is because they don't understand why bad things happen in this world now. They don't understand the roots of some of the systematic injustices that we face, the delusions and disinformation that pervade this country and the world. And that's part surprise, where people were raised in certain bubbles and they say, well, I don't understand how these people could vote for Donald Trump. And that's disheartening, and it creates cognitive dissonance because it doesn't make sense for their version of history. But there's a history out there that nothing comes out of nothing, right? So like, if you read the history about why things are the way they are, why America is the way they are, it's no longer surprising that 70 million people would vote for Donald Trump if you study the history. The cruelty, the illogicalness, the belief and fantasy, and the, putting your head in the sand, all that stuff existed back when the transcendentalists were around. Part of it's human nature. Part of it is that we're all building off each other, whether we're liberals or conservatives. And it, I think, creates a sense of hope that we are not, our illusions and our misunderstanding is not, is not based on nothing, but is the reason why the world is today is because very clear things have happened. And just because we don't know what they are, we can learn that and be like, this makes sense now. At least I can understand. And I think through understanding of history comes a deep sense of peace of mind.
I think that's an excellent place for us to end our reflections. I would like to forewarn any future listeners that both Reverend Schuyler and I considered careers in history. So on this podcast, you may encounter further historical reflections. We'd like to thank all of you who have joined us, both on the new YouTube version of Getting the Message, as well as the podcast. And thank you, Reverend Schuyler, for joining us.
Thank you. Thank you, Ember, for leading us in conversation.
Okay, and we will see you all later. Leave a like or a comment on whatever platform you are listening to us on.